Hello, everyone. Welcome to another week of coding. This week, we'll be covering diseases of the respiratory, digestive systems, and the skin. Let's have a look at some of the highlights. There we go. Lost it for a second. You'll notice that each of these chapters have chapter-specific guidelines with some examples. You may want to familiar yourself with some of these. For instance, this guideline here dealing with pneumonia and exacerbation. Exacerbation is one term that you will see from time to time when coding diseases of the respiratory system. There are other guidelines that cover acute respiratory failure as a secondary diagnosis, sequencing of respiratory failure and other acute conditions, and many, many others. You can find a nice summary of these in the chapter guidelines that should fall towards the very beginning of your textbook, right after the table that has the breakdown of these different codes. This is another chapter that has a lot of information such as this. Use additional code where applicable to identify exposure to environmental tobacco smoke, exposure to tobacco smoke in the perinatal period, tobacco dependence, and a lot of other things related to tobacco. We definitely want to make sure that we pick all these up. The other thing about this chapter, going by the last couple of terms that I've taught coding, is people forget about this. What this 5 here means is that you need a 5th character. Note here there's only 4. So if you select J01.2, it's an invalid code. In other words, you have to select one of these two, J01.20 or J01.21. We also have the codes of the digestive system. These all begin with the letter K, K00 through K95. And not a whole lot of things that are deep, dark, and mysterious. There are some notes that tell you to code also excludes 1, excludes 2, and others. The other thing is that this chapter does have a few terms that you may not be familiar with. For instance, terms like cholelithiasis, right, versus choledochlithiasis, cholecystitis. A lot of people, for whatever reason, seem to get these crossed up. So please pay special attention to these. And this is another chapter where you'll find a lot of excludes ones and then some other notes in terms of use additional code, right? Additional meaning following second. Then finally, we have diseases of the skin and the subcutaneous tissue. These all begin with the letter L, L00 through L99. And they have some chapter-specific guidelines. And again, as in the other chapters throughout this textbook, you find a nice summary of all these different guidelines. You may want to review some of these that show up not only in your textbook, but here in the very front of chapter 12. Chapter 12 being the chapter of the code book that has the diseases of the skin and subcutaneous tissues. And again, a lot of use additional codes, a lot of directions in the tabular. If you pay attention while you're reading in the tabular, you'll be fine. If you do not, unfortunately, you will be punished. So that's what we have on that. Please stop by office hours if you have any questions or concerns about this material. We'll see you online. Have a great week. Bye now.